All right, this is the January 31st meeting for Gateway API, depending on where you are. Let's get straight off with Richard's proposal for the JRPC route. I don't know, maybe Richard, can you give a bit of an introduction for what you were thinking here?
Sure. So first of all, as Rob said, I did come to a meeting over a year ago at this point to sort of just gauge interest. I've come back now with something more concrete, having had this on the back burner for a while now, and I'm more committed to getting this through now. At this point, the gap that you're seeing is, I would call it, a rough draft state. So I'm certainly open to any feedback that you might have. But the core of the idea here is we want to be able to route gRPC traffic in an idiomatic way for gRPC users. So that does not mean using full URIs, though gRPC generally runs on top of HTTP2. That's viewed as mostly an implementation detail, and folks using gRPC shouldn't have to know the way that services and methods are encoded into URIs and HTTP2. So for the most part, I've tried to recreate HTTP route as much as possible and deviate only in the ways that it makes sense for gRPC as a protocol and as a framework. So the areas in which you'll see that happening are under the matches. You'll see instead of a path match, we have a method match. So you have, you're going to match against a service, and you're going to match against a method. And you can see the details of exact match and regular expression match lower in the section that details the Go structs. We also have a few filters here. I had a few more filters in mind, but at least for this initial gap, I tried to keep it limited to what HTTP route has. I think in general, I'd like to increase the number of things that we have here. One element that I have not incorporated yet into this gap, but I think maybe needs to happen, is validation of configured features. So I think generally for the gateway APIs, folks have thought about, well, a gateway, some sort of proxy in the middle that will handle ingress for you. Something that I'd like for this to also be able to handle is proxyless service meshes. Right, so clients that connect to other clients without necessarily using an intermediary proxy. I know that there is some support for this via CRDs using parent refs that would connect to a CRD. So our issue is that certain types of data planes cannot handle all of the configuration that your conventional data plane might. And so we need some way to have people mark within their resource, in this case, the gRPC route, and say, I'm intending to run on a proxyless data plane, and it might not necessarily handle all of these features. And if they configure a feature within their gRPC route that is not supported by the data plane, there's a configuration time error. Otherwise, you run into all sorts of tricky issues where, like, you have a security feature that you don't know isn't enabled until an outage happens, something like that. So other than that, I think this should be pretty uncontroversial in terms of the design. So one of the main things that I wanted to hear today is just sort of gauge the level of interest among the community and see if there's any just high level critiques of the concept that I'm proposing here.
I think I'm pretty excited by seeing this. We have been wanting to explore this area for a while, but we just put it on a back burner. So having this as part of the core or extended API, I think makes a lot of sense. One thing that I think on seeing this is that got me thinking is, how about conflict resolution? I mean, we have this problem in HTTP route itself, but do you see conflict resolution as being any different? So imagine that two routes are configured for the same gRPC service, or or the same gRPC method, if that's the granularity somebody is operating at. So what do you think about that?
So my first question would be, do you, I actually don't know this detail. Do you allow multiple HTTP routes to be configured with the same host name?
Yes, we currently do.
You do, okay. I didn't realize that. Under like my existing mental model, you wouldn't allow two gRPC routes to be configured that have the same host name. So how do you handle this for HTTP route today?
A long set of rules, but it's longest matching host name, longest matching path, most number of matching headers. I forget when you go down the list, but there's a list somewhere that's rather, I don't know how broadly that is actually implemented, but at least conceptually there's an agreement.
And there is also a filter at the gateway listener level, where gateway admins could say that, okay, any route selected by a listener, they can only have these host names or these host name suffixes, things like that.
Do you merge the multiple rules that match according to like some precedents, or is it you select one as the rule?
It's merge.
Merge, okay. I think I'd need to incorporate that into my mental model, but if you already have a set of rules that seem to be working, I don't have a strong reason at the moment to say that we shouldn't incorporate that into this design. Like, I don't want to reinvent the wheel here with this.
Yeah, I think the sort of match and merge behavior was like the best that we could, so it was like, that was definitely an arrived after a lot of discussion position. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that you have a look at it, parse it, and make sure that it makes sense for what you're talking about, and and then try and incorporate it. I think, yeah, a lot of the time that sort of thing, it's one of those things where it makes writing the edge case tests and stuff like nasty, but it's the increased flexibility is very useful for people. As Rob said, I don't know, it's in the API. I don't know how well it is available, tested, and so on in all the implementations at the moment. So I think that it's pretty good. The concepts themselves are pretty good. I feel pretty confident that we've dialed in the right concepts there. But you sort of made a mention before that it's in there and it's in use. I'm like, well, we can't really say it's in there and it's in use, like and be 100% sure that we're really doing that. But are we going to change it? I'd be pretty reluctant to change it at this point. Like, I'm pretty sure we've got the right thing going on.
Right. I'll take a look at that. I know at this point, this is like a rough draft of a GEP. Like, there definitely needs to be more detail in terms of the comments. And I think that should certainly be one of those things that's incorporated.
I have one more question. Go ahead, Rob.
Go for it here.
Okay, so have you thought about gRPC reflections?
Okay.
Like, would those be transparently supported, or like, do we need to express those at the API, like at the CRD definition layer, or not?
It's an interesting idea. It's something I've thought about. It could represent a security issue potentially. We've thought about, like, for example, in the gRPC library, automatically turning on a reflection server unless you like have an environment variable or something like that. And inevitably we get to the point where we say, okay, we can't do this. And I think you probably have the same issue here. You could maybe make it a little bit easier in terms of UX by offering like a bool that says like enable routing for reflection. But that has not been incorporated in this design yet. It is an interesting idea though.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat about listeners and how the upstreams, the parent ref stuff will work. I would like to talk about that too, but I do want to just drill in on that a little bit. Yeah, I think we've had some requests, like, obviously I work in Contour. We've had some requests for literally that exact same thing, to do the JSON, to do the HTTP1 JSON, REST translation to gRPC for you. And so, I definitely think there's, like, the point that I'm trying to make there is there's definitely some appetite for the gRPC reflection stuff around, and having, having the ability to have the gateway API represent the concept that, you've got an ingress controller that's a HTTP 1.1 gateway, but that has a gRPC route behind it, and have that represent in some fashion that translation point, and have your implementation be able to say, yes, I can do that, or no, I can't, seems like it would be very useful. And so I guess that leads on to the other thing I just wanted to briefly mention before we go on and talk about like the parent ref stuff, is one of the things I'd like to see you talk about a little bit, and is how the status will work. The status for the gRPC route object, what I have found is when designing any of the route objects, it's really easy to miss things until you hit the status and you start trying to be like, how am I going to tell people that this is correctly configured? And how am I going to tell people that that something is broken? And if so, what is broken? And that's when you do this, when you do the status design is when you do that. I think you have got, did you have a status thing in there? I did have
I do not know.
Yeah, so it's 100% fine. Like you said, it's a draft, it's no problem, but that is definitely one of the things I would say is spend a little bit of time and think about, like, on a gRPC route, how would you know that everything is configured correctly? What would you want to know that's not configured correctly? How would that information be surfaced? What would it look like? Look at the HTTP route, how we've done the HTTP route. That is not to say that how we've done the HTTP route status is finished. This HTTP route status and in general route status is 100% not finished. So any contribution you have there will be gratefully accepted, because probably there's improvements we can make to the HTTP route objects. The gateway status is pretty good, I think, but like the HTTP route status is not. So, and again, the reason I say that is that I have found that there's been a couple of times when we're like, oh, this is almost done, and we go to do the status, and then we're like, oh no, we missed this and this and this and this and this, because we didn't think about how we were going to close the loop and get information back to the person who configured the resource.
Interesting. If you could point me towards like any documents or PRs where those discussions have happened, I'd appreciate that.
I'll have a look and see. If not, please feel free to hit me up. I have thought a lot about this, and starting to try and write some things down about it. So, but this is one of those very deep magic kind of areas at the moment, because there's no best practice yet.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Gotcha. I mean, it's definitely something that I care a lot about. One of the things that I think most about in terms of like configuring gRPC traffic for like different kinds of service meshes is the config validation, because of the reasons I brought up earlier.
And I think the config time validation that you were talking about, in my mind, that's what we have the validation webhook for. Again, I think I took the action item, Rob, to do something about like defining how important that the validating webhook is, but in essence, we haven't written it down anywhere yet. But basically, that the validating webhook that the Gateway API supplies is an integral part of the thing that is intended to do exactly what you're talking about. That's intended to make it so that you have config time, some level of config time validation that says the thing that you are doing is not supported, or the thing that you're doing I can't do, or that sort of thing. So that idea that it's much better UX, as you say, to have, you try to apply an object and you get rather than you apply an object and then you have to go and look up the status, or worse, you apply an object and then you go to check and see if it's working and it's silently not working. So I 100% agree with you on that. And there's plenty of other work we got to do in the rest of the core bits to tidy that up. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew about that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I guess things in the chat. For Practicalism, would the gateway advertise an address or something in addition to the route? So the service would be dialed directly rather than through the gateway, or am I misunderstanding that? Would the gateway advertise an address?
So I think in this case, what we need to talk about here is, you mentioned briefly about how there's some configurability available for using the parent ref.
Right.
Rather than, I guess one of the things that the GEP needs to talk about a little bit is like, what happens when you attach this to a gateway? And then, but also, like, as you talk about, like, if there's a proxyless like data plane, where you're talking about a service mesh style thing, like, what is the upstream resource that you would talk about in that case? Right. Like, a mesh resource. Do we put a mesh resource as part of the gateway API? I don't know. Like, but that's the sort of stuff we need to talk about, I think.
Sure. So the way I'd imagine it, suppose you want to have a gRPC route that can be picked up by either sidecar proxies or in a proxyless service mesh. Then I imagine you define a single gRPC route, and you'd have one parent ref be your conventional gateway, and that's going to be picked up by your sidecar proxies. And then for proxyless mesh, you'd have some other resource, which could be a CRD. It could be some new core resource called mesh or proxyless mesh or something like that. And the presence of this other resource in the parent refs would lead to the control plane programming the configuration such that a client using the host name defined in the gRPC route is directed to the backends associated with the gRPC route. I don't know if that makes things clearer or murkier.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense. So this is like the proxyless gRPC, like, is it gRPC XDS integration? I remember seeing something like this for like a year or so ago. Okay, that makes more sense. Thanks.
Right. So one of my MOs is I want data plane polymorphism for gRPC. Like every piece of configuration I create ideally works for both sidecar-based meshes and proxyless meshes. And then Mikhail asks, is there a need for a special listener to support gRPC routes? And this is part of the gateway resource. I don't think so. I think nothing about gateways, the gateway resource should have to change, at least for the sidecar-based data plane option.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm a little interested in gRPC route from a completely different perspective here. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a new precedent for us in that it feels like it's a protocol or a route that lives on top of another protocol route we have with HTTP route. Mm-hmm. It seems like, you know, from the outside looking in, I haven't dug into this as much as I wanted to, but it seems like a lot of the content in here could theoretically be translated to an HTTP route. You lose a lot of context with that. I'm not saying that's a good or bad idea. I'm just, for context and for, you know, future facing, you know, let's say we have another protocol a few months from now that lives on top of HTTP, you know, how do we decide as a community that this protocol on top of HTTP belongs as a separate route type versus something that can be converted into an HTTP route? So I guess that's a lot of questions or discussion without a clear question, but really maybe the clearest question would be, is it even possible to take the content you have here and build something that would translate it to HTTP route? Whether or not that's a good or bad idea, I don't know.
I think it is technically possible, yes. The data plane polymorphism stuff that I just mentioned could get tricky because now you have to support proxyless service mesh for HTTP route when I know of no HTTP proxyless service mesh implementations. So in theory, yes, it is doable. It would be not ideal for users of gRPC, and then because of the polymorphism thing, not ideal for users of HTTP either. I also make the case for gRPC having a special relationship with the Kubernetes project in the intro here. And I think that's decently solid, right? Like gRPC is already a somewhat privileged protocol within the Kubernetes ecosystem anyway. So I don't think it leads to like sort of a slippery slope argument here.
Yeah, no, I think you made really good. I liked your introduction. I thought those were great points. I think that's just something that we should touch on somewhere in this gap. You know, you've already shown pretty clearly that gRPC has this special place in Kubernetes, but just, and maybe this isn't necessarily a requirement of this gap as a whole, but something that we as a community need to figure out of what protocols deserve their own core route types, which is something we've kind of been struggling with. It seems like there's pretty broad support for gRPC here. Just need to have some kind of clear guidelines going forward of what other protocols make sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that That sounds a lot like an alternatives considered section to me. But Luana's had her hand up for a little bit, so we should hear from her.
Yeah, I have a similar question. I think mentioned about this proxy list, or I had a similar question on HTTP route itself, because today, when you look at HTTP route, to find out the status, you have to go to its parent gateway. As you mentioned, you may not, some implementation may not want to have gateway. So I'm asking, is it possible to have a status inside the gateway object itself? You can store whatever things you need, that's my question here.
Status in the gateway as opposed to the route?
No, a status inside the HTTP route.
Oh.
So today, HTTP route object itself has no status. It basically has a point to parent status.
Gotcha.
Parent in today is a gateway, which you can have many HTTP route or TLS route. And you have to go through the condition list, which is the list to find out the one that you think it belongs to your gateway and take it from there. So what I'm saying is it possible to have a, just for each HTTP route, like any other object, can we have a status there?
I would say yes, and we hadn't built it yet. So I'd say absolutely yes, the HTTP route should have a status. One of the sort of the guidelines that I keep for myself with this sort of thing is you should be able to figure out what's going on with the thing you care about by hopping to as few number of objects as possible, right? Like, so if there's a problem on your HTTP route, you should only need to look at your HTTP route to see the problem is there. I 100% agree with you. And the same with JRPC route or whatever. And that's why I pushed the status thing before, Richard, that like you should be able to find out if there's a problem with your route by looking at your route, not by having to go to the gateway to look at the thing. Like 100% agree. This is a thing that we have that has been on the back burner that like I said, I care a lot about, but that I haven't had a chance to circle back around and have a look at yet. So I would encourage you, Learn, to have a think about what sort of stuff you would want to put on there. I think do we have conditions on there yet? I can't remember. It's been a while since I looked at it. Yeah. So if you can squash some stuff into conditions, that would be good. If not, then yeah, like if you want to be able to put some information about once the reconciliation process is finished and the handshake is finished and everything is good, and you want to be able to have a way to represent this route is available through these gateways or on these IP addresses or something like that, that would make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, Rob?
Yeah, we have struggled with status for a long time. And I think if you're willing or able to make an issue to track this, it would be really helpful. Some of the boundaries or problems we've run into are, one, any status you put on HTTP route needs to be nested within the gateway, because we need to, this is true for any protocol, you just need to know what controller is responsible for writing that status. And we want a route to be implemented by 5 different controllers in an ideal world, and them not to fight over status.
So maybe another way to say that is it needs to be namespaced by gateway.
Yeah, good point. So that's why everything is already kind of namespace in that parent ref status thing. The other concern that I would have with propagating status from gateway down to route is if you have a gateway that's say representing a load balancer that's flapping between healthy and unhealthy, it's not in the best state. You can imagine that, say you have hundreds of routes attached to that gateway, and every time it flaps between those states, you have to propagate status to 100 plus child resources. That adds cost and other concerns there. I'm not saying this is a good or bad idea, and I may have misunderstood exactly what you're representing, but I think at a minimum, we should have some kind of issue or discussion on GitHub just to continue this.
Okay, so the next step is basically raising an issue on this. Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, I think, as I said, like I'm in broadly support, but yeah, one of the traps, the classic Kubernetes API trap is fan out problems. Especially for status updates, where affecting one resource then means you have to write 20 or 30 updates, and if you're doing that a couple of times a second, all of a sudden your API server is very busy just churning churning status updates, which is not ideal. And so you just need to be careful about fan out problems in terms of.
That's a very good point. Yeah. So one other question on this, if I can ask, do you ever envision like today's service, right? People service is a way of grouping all the backends. Do you ever envision that HTTP route will be replacing, like become the first class citizen? People basically will define HTTP route without even define. I mean, gateway is there, but it's more like linking to which controller manage the HTTP route. But HTTP route become like people will just use HTTP route and even without gateway, and then the service just another like a deployment, grouping the backend paths together. And
you want to take it, Rob, or should I go?
Yeah, so I would love to get to that point. I think there's a few things. One, I think there's going to be a lot more routes, specifically HTTP routes, but routes of any protocol than there are gateways in any given cluster. And I hope that gateways become not an implementation detail, but an infrastructure detail that are largely unchanged through their life cycle, where you're just attaching routes. So I hope that's true. And I also, this is a terrible idea that I haven't pursued very far, but it's at least technically possible for an HTTP route to forward to something that isn't a service, right? So you really could simplify your stack. Again, not saying it's a good idea, but like you're saying, you could simplify it so HTTP route is really this core resource. And you're not thinking too much about gateway or service. You're just thinking about your deployment and your HTTP route. I don't know how long it'll take to get there, if we'll get there. But I do think HTTP route is really going to be the most commonly used part of this API, or maybe gRPC route, who knows? But routes in general.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think what Rob just described is like, if we had to build up on ingress resource, then what would happen?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think it's actually one of the things. I was writing a thing today, the other day, and I realized that when I went to the intro page of our thing, we actually don't have like a 2-sentence description of what the Gateway API is actually for. In my mind, the Gateway API is about establishing a way for people to talk about communication between services, like, but where that crosses a cluster boundary. Like, yeah, that's what the gateway itself, that's what it is. The gateway sits at some sort of cluster boundary. Exactly what boundary that is a bit fuzzy, but like there's definitely a logical boundary that the gateway sits at, and that's it translates in some way between stuff that knows about the inner workings of inside the boundary and stuff that doesn't. And so you can kind of move that boundary around and put it like that the gateway or the thing that's upstream of your routes is like a mesh or something like that. And in that case, you're talking about things that are like talking within the mesh and things like that. But the idea here is that there's some layer of like something knows how to do this lot and something outside doesn't. And that's the key thing. And so in terms of service and stuff like that, in the future, obviously the biggest thing that we are looking to not replace, because it'll never go away, it's a V1 API, but basically subsume is service type load balancer is the biggest one that we're trying to get. We're trying to make it so you don't need to use that anymore, right? Like with the Gateway API, because you'll have the Gateway API, it'll be a better, more configurable, more explicit, less magic way to do the same thing that you do with service type load balancer today. And the same with ingress. The idea here is that HTTP route plus a gateway should provide you everything you can do in ingress, but make it clearer, more explicit, and able to be moved between providers much more easily. So you don't end up with, 400 annotations on a page that describe all of the cool things you can do with your ingress, right? Like that is not what anybody wants. We want that to be in the upstream API so that everybody doesn't re-implement that in a slightly different way. And so if I were to summarize in sort of a few things, it's like, take the stuff that we've done before, like build APIs that take the stuff that we've done before, but better, and make it interoperable are sort of the big goals of the Gateway API project. In terms of, sorry, Rob, I'm almost done, I promise. In terms of, what we're going to do about, like, do we see that routes will replace like service or something like that? I mean, service is always going to be the bucket you put your actual pods in, right? Like that is what service is really for. What services ended up being is it's in it's really handy to have a bucket that you put some pods in for lots of reasons. And the service has ended up being the place where anytime you need to make a bucket that have pods and you need some extra thing about that, you just chuck it in service, right? Like, and that's what services ended up being. It's a big grab bag of features. And the idea here is to pull some of that stuff out, make it more explicit, make it easier to understand and less magic. Sorry, Rob, I'm done.
No worries. Yeah, that's a good description there. And I think what Richard is proposing here with GRPC route and this idea that we may have proxyless routes make proxyless, in my mind, might be gatewayless routes, which almost turns us into an API that should have been called routing API instead of gateway API. But you know, we're not going to rename our API again. But anyways, I appreciate this route proposal just because it starts to make me think at least about routes that may or may not exist, you know, may or may not require a gateway, which is true of all of our routes, but it seems especially true here. So yeah, that's all I was thinking. I don't know if there's any more. It looks like there's a few more questions or discussion in chat.
So, question from Mikhail, and I think a really good question, one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Are there any use cases for HTTP routes and gRPC routes to coexist for same host name? If so, so that we will need to merge the rules from different route types. Yeah, so in the past, what we used to tell people to do for gRPC traffic and HTTP traffic is have different host names for gRPC and for HTTP. And people don't like to hear that. People like to hang things off of like path prefixes. So instead of having like grpc.foo.com and foo.com, you have foo.com/grpc or something like that. So we decided to stop telling people to have different host names and instead to support a feature basically like this. And the thought that came to everyone's head when we asked how do we accomplish this merge is, well, okay, you make the more specific match apply after the more general matches, right? So you've got some route that owns / and you've got some route that owns like /grpc or some better name. After looking at that, along with like header matches and the various other match options that we offer, we realized, I actually wrote a proof for this, it's mathematically impossible to determine what the most specific match is. So I sort of put that away. And I realized, like, we're talking about encapsulated protocols here, right? So if you just sort of assume that the one that is lower in the hierarchy, like the more general one, in this case, HTTP, is the more broad one, then the problem just sort of goes away. You say these two routes share a host name, one is HTTP, one is gRPC. Well, okay, apply the HTTP matching rules first, and then you apply the gRPC rules first. And the same logic could apply if you're talking about TCP versus HTTP, right? Like, okay, do all the TCP traffic here, except for the stuff that ends up being matched by this. And I think the whole diagram just sort of flows pretty well if you do it that way. Does that answer your question, Mikhail?
Well, yeah, at least it's what I think is we will need to have define the rules so that we all understand the expected behavior. So maybe it's worth capturing it in the proposal.
Definitely. So my proposal would just be apply HTTP matches before gRPC matches in this case. Does it sound reasonable?
Sounds reasonable to me. I think that you mentioned the TCP, HTTP as a similar sort of isomorphic mapping, and I agree. We haven't actually talked a lot about that, but that is definitely a similar problem that needs to be resolved as well. That what happens when you have TCP routes and HTTP routes that match the same things. Like, I think the implicit assumption we all had was that it would behave exactly as you say, that TCP routes go first, HTTP routes go second. More specific trumps least specific is the rule here.
Right.
And gRPC is more specific than HTTP.
Definitely.
So Harry, does that answer the question that you had about the route without a protocol? Like,
yeah, I mean, it sort of does, but I mean, what sort of I mean, we can do a lot of policy management because we already have a different route type. But what would be like? I don't know. I haven't thought through this question, right? Like we are introducing a protocol without, we are introducing a route without a corresponding protocol. Does
I
that
mean,
violate any decisions that we've made in other parts of the API, or like in terms anything like that?
yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like it to me because this is, I mean, gRPC is still a protocol, right? Like, but you mean a transport layer, like, or sort of a transport layer?
So yeah, I should clarify by protocol. I mean, we have a defined list of protocols inside our repo, right? Like,
Yeah.
so like the listener protocols, that's what I mean.
Ah, right. Yeah. Okay. The listener protocols. Yeah. So part of this will be that we need to define gRPC as a listener protocol.
I think that's where we are not all in agreement. I think Rob just said the opposite thing in the.
No. So, I know. But like that part of it would be that if this were to go ahead, then we would need to say, we need to define what it means to be a protocol in the listener and how that works and how that implies rules like we talked about. And that's what you're talking about, right? Like, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree that is a discussion that we need to have. I'm not saying that we should do one thing or another, but like that is definitely a discussion that we need to have.
Okay. Yeah. That's. I think I was just thinking about that, and that's a question in the same direction. Rob, you go ahead. Add something.
No, that covered it well. I also am not quite sure the implications for listener. Like right now we say, I think the way that we rely on it is that implementations are supposed to fill in the route types they support by default for a given protocol. So you could say that if an implementation supports gRPC route and they see an HTTP listener, they could say, hey, I support both HTTP route and gRPC route for this protocol you've specified. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't need a new protocol. I'm not sure, but more discussion needed on that.
Yeah, I don't think we need to solve it in this call. But yeah, so Richard, I think the action item for you here is just have a look over how we talk about the listener and how the listener flow, how the route to gateway binding flow works. I know that a lot of what you're thinking about is not the route, the gateway binding flow because of the proxy listing, but like I think if you understand how that works for the HTTP route, then you'll understand a little bit more about what Harry's saying here, and then we need to make sure that we address that as part of this get.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, I want to leave some time for the other things on the agenda. Were there any last comments on gRPC route?
I think Mikhail wanted to know if would route to route delegation cover this use case if our HTTP route could delegate to a gRPC route.
I think it could. My question would be, is this precedented elsewhere in the API? Like, is route delegation well supported?
No, because it's not finished.
Gotcha.
But it's just something to keep in mind that route delegation is coming. It is definitely a thing that we are planning on supporting. That's why it says parent ref and not gateway ref. Is that ideally parent ref will be able to point to another route.
I see.
Yeah, and so the intent here is not to allow arbitrarily nested HTTP routes either. It's only going to be one layer ever. So
interesting.
Because so I can speak to that from my contour experience where our HTTP proxy does allow arbitrarily nested route inclusion. And if, as you would imagine, building the graph is complicated, you need to worry about loops. You need to worry about, there's a bunch of stuff there that limiting the number of delegation hops means that you don't have to worry about building a full DAG of making sure it is acyclic of references.
Yeah, the current proposal, which is incomplete, is that a route could only delegate or include another route of the same kind.
Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, so that would actually preclude the case that Mikhail is talking about there. Thanks, Jeff. I'd forgotten about that. It was in the before times before I was away from us, so I lost the context.
Cool. All right. Good discussion. I'm looking forward to getting back into route delegation too. This will add a whole new perspective on that.
Yeah, I'm back, Rob.
Yeah, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back, Jeff.
Cool. All right, with that, let's move on. There's just a couple things I had in issue triage, but definitely I just add things that are top of mind for me, but always feel free to add things to this list, to the agenda as a whole. Last week was crazy for me. Busy week on other things, but yeah, it looks like there's one comment left on this particular PR of mine, but these are the conformance tests that I originally had in that big, massive conformance test PR. I think it was Harry wisely suggested I split out all but one conformance test. So this is the rest of them. If anyone has time, they're fairly contained now and smaller than originally. So if anyone has time for review, not worth going through on this call, but just want to highlight them. The other one, I feel like we've gone back and forth on this because it's another gap. And I would love to reach some kind of conclusion on this one. I don't think there's a real strong consensus either way on this. But the proposal is, and I don't think this person is on the call, correct me if I'm wrong, don't see them. The proposal is really simple on its surface. It's to add section name, well, it's to add name to route rule. So very similar to gateway listener name, the idea of a section name for attachment, for logging, for whatever it might be. The GEP goes into a variety of details. It feels like, I don't know, I'm pretty hesitant to go forward with it, but I wanted to give everyone else a chance to, either start a discussion here, any kind of hesitation you have or any support you might have for this kind of addition would be welcome.
I've got thoughts on this one, Rob. So my thought here is I actually don't mind the idea, but if we're going to do it, it has to be required, which is a breaking change, which means another API version, which means we delay beta. The reason I think it should be required is that it actually creates a lot of problems if it's optional. How can you look at, how could you parse the logs if you can have an optional name or, as opposed to like a section number? What happens, I think, Rob, you raised an interesting case of like, what happens if you give a name that's just a number? How do you distinguish that from a section number? There's a few other things there that I think, I think, as I said there, I think the options are either that we don't do this, or if we are going to do it, we have to break compatibility and do a V1 Alpha 3 and make it required. Because, I mean, I think that it definitely, there's a nice UX element to it, that having this sort of thing be a named, like a list type map, and named essentially a map of the rules rather than a list is okay. The one thing that I literally just thought of that it does do is that right now, because rules are an array, they are implicitly ordered. If we move it to like a list type map, then you kind of lose the implicit ordering. And so that would then mean that we'd probably need to add like a priority field or something like that to re-add the ordering. So I think there's a couple of big trade-offs here. I appreciate that it's important for for the use case that is in this thing, that like being able to build configs reliably. But I do think that and there are some UX benefits, but I think that it's a much more significant change than it seems on the surface.
As mentioned in the intro to it, I think this is one of the things that originally was part of the route delegation that I didn't think we would need, but the more and more I've been working on it, the more I'm coming to the view that we probably do need to have the ability to name a section or something with the matching rules, so that we can be clear on where we're trying to delegate or include a rule.
Yeah, that's
delegate or include not a rule, but a route. Excuse me.
That's a good point. I've been It really depends on which way we do route delegation. So thank you for bringing that up. You know, if we're doing route delegation or inclusion or whatever it is, top down, you know, route references child, the rule name doesn't seem to matter. It's just secondary. If we're using parent ref, it seems very, very relevant as you're describing, right? You don't want to attach to everything. You want to attach to a very specific part of a route.
May want to attach to a very specific part of the route.
What's that?
May.
Yeah.
RFC Rob.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So, that's tricky. I am really, really hesitant to so first off, I'm one who actually proposed something like awfully similar to this back in the days of policy attachment. If you remember the policy attachment gap, I had a section name on gateway listener and route rule. And feedback then was, well, hey, do we really need it? And there was a good enough use case for gateway listener. There wasn't for route rule. So stayed on gateway listener, did not on route rule. I've since become convinced that, okay, well, a gateway listener is very much required because a gateway is a singular representation of something. With routes, we've said any route can be merged with any other route. So having a route with multiple rules is nothing but a convenience. It is not required. For any use case where you have two route rules, you can just as easily have two routes with a single rule each. So that's kind of been what I've been pushing back on is, well, you can do this today. And we could technically say for route inclusion, delegation, whatever it is, to attach to a parent route, that parent route has to have exactly one route rule, or maybe another way of saying it, when you attach to a parent route, you're attaching to everything in that parent route. So make that a small route if it needs to be. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. I'm really hesitant to push another release, like to push V1 Alpha 3 if we don't need to. But I do agree with Nick that if we're going to do this, it should be required. And if it should be required, it requires V1 Alpha 3. And the only time to do that is now. We're not going to do that post beta. So, yeah.
Yeah, with the route delegation stuff, the doing it top down, where you know the at the gateway or at the parent route, you define it. You know, so that the parent route explicitly calls the child route. That works one way, and we don't. And you're right, Rob. We don't need kind of a name for a matching rule there. The opposite model, where we want to have it so that from a delegation of authority or responsibility, that I just kind of open up this match to allow, you know, anybody from namespace foo to attach a route to it. Then that's where I need probably will need a name. So it's, if we want to support, excuse me, if we want to support both models, I think we're going to have to.
No,
I'm open to, you know, if we want to say we don't want to support, you know, both models of delegation / inclusion. You know.
Yeah, I'm inclined to. So Contour HTTP proxy has an inclusion functionality. It is top down only. We have got a lot of pushback from people that it's useful for the use case where you have, what that does is it forces a human to be in a loop. So it means that you can't add more, you can't easily programmatically, or like you can't say allow everything in a namespace or something like that to bind, because you can't, because it's a one-to-one mapping. You've got to have each specific one is done. And that was done so that the person who controls the higher layer can control. But I think that we have better mechanisms to do that in the Gateway API because we've solved the exact same problem with the gateway to route binding. And so I think we need to take the same mechanism we use for the gateway to route binding and use that for the inclusion of delegation. what that means is that that's a bottom-up thing that's using the parent ref with a so it's the below thing refers to the parent one. The parent one has the chance to say no by having like a narrowing specification. If we do that, as you say, like having the name. So what you're saying is that we couldn't mandate what Rob is saying and say, if you're binding to the thing, you bind to all of the route or none of the route. And I think that is definitely worth considering, because that's like a API level push for people to keep their routes small. If we provide too much functionality around naming subroutes, what we're going to end up with is people having wanting to have thousands of route rule entries in a single route, which I think is an anti-pattern. It's a smell. And so like we want to encourage people in as many ways as possible to have more smaller objects, because they're easier to understand, they're easier to pass, they're easier to do status for. They're it's better API design, I think, in terms of Kubernetes API, to have more smaller objects rather than large objects that have a lot of things. What it does mean, though, is that if we're going to have lots of more smaller objects with references between them, and maybe, is that then we have to have really clear rules about what happens when you have about conflict resolution. What happens when you have the same thing? Do you merge them? Is there a conflict? Do they get rejected? That sort of thing. And so there's a lot of fiddly stuff that we did for like Rob said, we've got a big list for HTTP route of what happens when you have a HTTP routes that match on various criteria, which one goes first, which one, when do they get rejected? Basically, we're going to have to repeat that process for each time we do this sort of thing. Hopefully, after we've done it a few times, we will get a sense of like, this is the right way to do it, and it should get easier and easier. But it feels to me like the more that we make that the gateway to route and route to route relationships similar, the easier the API will be to understand and use. If we make the route to route relationship different to the gateway to route one, then that we are building like a big headache for ourselves down the road. And all of that, that higher level stuff all then flows down here. That I guess what I'm saying is I am actually increasingly in favor of us. Sadly, I don't want to do it, but just biting the bullet, doing a V1 alpha 3, making the thing named a little bit there, to some extent. But then on the other side of it is we have that then encourages that other problem. So then I'm not in favor of it again, right? So I think there's really strong arguments for and against here, and that we need to be very careful with it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is not the best argument for anything, but when I look at our examples right now, if I imagine that every route match, every route rule we have would have to become named, that adds, a great deal of verbosity to the API that I can imagine 90% of users, 95% of users would never benefit from. That's somewhat the case for Gateway Listener, but again, I'd go back to this idea in my mind of, for every one Gateway Listener, there will be 10 to 100 routes, right? And within each route, multiple rules. So we've gone from adding a relatively minimal cost of a few times per gateway to, every single time you define a route rule. I'm really, and Nick, you raised a good point too, of allowing for nesting inside routes, allowing for named references inside routes is by definition going to lead to users creating larger routes than I think we really want. The more I think about this, the more I regret having a list of rules inside route at all, right? Like a list within, a list that could just as easily be accomplished with multiple resources. Maybe we messed up there. I'm not sure. But doubling down on that and saying, hey, we're going to add names here so you can reference this list item easier, feels like we may be going even further in that direction. I don't know. I'm really hesitant to do a V1 alpha 3, but I also know we should not make this decision lightly, whatever we do. And we need to at least have some kind of rough picture for for what we want to do for route delegation. I'm not saying we should have a get merged or anything, but we should make sure that whatever decision we make here is not going to be something like we regret when we're planning for route delegation. So like I said, this seemed like a really, you're adding, the proposal was to add an optional name field on route rule, and it seemed, well, that should be so straightforward. And no, it's not, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, you turn over the rock and you find like 3 other rocks you got to turn over, right? Like, yeah. So I actually think one of the things we need to do, Rob, maybe you or I should do this, is do a quick check back in upstream with API machinery and say, hey, we've kind of got a decision point here where we're going to push people towards having more smaller objects or larger objects with more things inside them. Do you have any feedback about which is better? I suspect the answer is more smaller objects is better, but I could be wrong. And so, the upstream API machinery will have had experiences about this, and that should inform our decision.
Yeah, good point.
I'll try really hard to have the full route delegation proposal ready for next week. Not to say that it may not undergo significant changes as we work through it, but at least it'll be a stake in the ground.
Like, I think what Richard's done here today is a great way to do it. Like, bring a draft that has enough detail for us to talk about, and go away and generate some action items for you. I think that's probably better than a more complete proposal that you then have to redo significant chunks of.
Yeah, this has been great, and I agree. I mean, I think what we don't need to have all the details nailed down. I just would help a lot with this decision to have a direction for route delegation. We've kind of been flip-flopping between a top-down or bottom-up. I tend to agree with Nick that, and I think you, Jeff, as well, that bottom-up is probably a better means and more consistent with the rest of the API. But again, just would be good to see that. And thank you very much for taking some time to continue on that.
Yeah. When I said complete, I didn't mean like code it out and everything. Just covering, hopefully covering all the things it needs to cover.
Yeah, logically complete. Yeah. I get it. Yeah. I also wanted to take a minute just to say thanks to Richard for a really awesome proposal that had just enough detail for us to really dig our teeth into and generate some great discussion. Really appreciate it, man.
Thank you all for the feedback.
Yeah, this was great. I've got to run to my next meeting, but thank you everyone for a great discussion today, and we'll talk to everyone next week. See you.